the Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Welcome back to another episode of the mini-series on rumors and gossip at the Tudor court. I'm Lacey Bonar Hull, and today I'll be chatting with two fantastic guests about rumors surrounding the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I. My first guest is Dr. Joanne Paul, a historian, writer, and broadcaster who works on the cultural, political, and intellectual history of the Tudor and Stuart periods. She's published books on Thomas More and the counselors in the Tudor and Stuart courts. And her latest book, The House of Dudley, takes the reader through 3 generations of the scandalous Dudley family. My second guest is Dr. Linda Porter, a Tudor and Stuart historian who has written 5 critically acclaimed books on Mary I, Catherine Parr, the rivalry between the Tudors and the Stuarts, the children of Charles I, and the mistresses of Charles II. She is currently writing a biography of Henry VIII's elder sister, Margaret Tudor, Queen of Scots. She was the historical consultant on Lucy Worsley's popular series, 6 Wives, and on the more recent documentary, The Boleyns. She lives in Kent, not far from Hever Castle, where she strolled in the beautiful rose garden just a few hours ago. Listen in as Joanne and Linda discuss some of the salacious rumors and court gossip that concerned one of England's most illustrious monarchs. Okay, hi, Joanne and Linda. I hope you're both doing well. I'm really excited to be chatting with you both about rumors regarding Elizabeth I. So we have 5 questions. The first 2 for you, Joanne, the second 2 for you, Linda, and then the last one, I'm just going to open the floor for discussion. So since we have a decent amount of ground to cover, I think let's just go ahead and jump right in. So first, Joanne, I'm sure when most of us think about Elizabeth I, we think of her as the Virgin Queen, but it seems that not everyone agrees with that assessment. So were there any rumors at the Elizabethan court about the Queen's sexual experiences? Maybe something with her great favorite, Robert Dudley?
Yeah, great question. And one that comes up fairly frequently. I mean, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It's especially wonderful to be here with Professor Linda Porter, of whom I am a great admirer. So this is fantastic.
Thank you. You just promoted me, Joanne. I've never actually been a professor, but I am a doctor.
There we go. Well,
I was an associate professor when I lived in New York, so I guess it's not totally inaccurate.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, certainly, I've been spending time with Canadian students the last few days, for whom everyone is a professor. So, as maybe they should be. Anyway, yes, the so-called Virgin Queen. Absolutely, there were rumors circulating fairly soon after she came to the throne that she may have been living in dishonor, and it might have had something to do with her master of the horse, who is, of course, Robert Dudley, her great favorite, as you said. Ambassadors, their accounts sort of fall into 2 categories, either those that were convinced that she was having a physical love affair with Robert, and those that were convinced that she was absolutely chaste and nothing at all was going on. What I think is even more interesting than the rumors is the little bits of evidence that we find sometimes that might lead us as historians one way or another. Certainly, Henry Sidney, Robert Dudley's brother-in-law, talks about them as having a love affair. Whether we think that is physical or not is certainly up to our own interpretation. And the ambassador that he's speaking to at the time, the Spanish ambassador, says that he's heard such things that he dare not write 2 lines of it to his king. One assumes because it might be smutty. Accounts show them dining together, gifts being exchanged. Certainly they were very, very close. Elizabeth's own response to these sorts of suggestions isn't as convincing as we might think it would be when it's brought to her by Kat Ashley, her close friend, really. She suggests that, well, it isn't possible because everyone's watching her all the time. But even if it were possible, she could do what she likes. And so we get this sense of her sort of protesting too much. And when she's dying or potentially dying, she of course doesn't die of smallpox, but when she is potentially dying of smallpox, she says that nothing dishonorable has ever happened between her and Robert, but she does give £500 to the groom who sleeps in his chamber. So we have all this sort of very confusing information. I mean, I guess what I think is important about these rumors is their effect, right? The way in which it prompts everyone to keep an eye on her. What they tell us too about the importance of the Queen's body, and who has access to the Queen's body. The sort of jealous rumors about them kissing is not just about people speculating whether they did or didn't, but is because that sort of physical proximity means power. And so there's a concern about Robert Dudley's closeness to the Queen's body in terms of that being the source of power. And of course, it tells us a great deal about the relationship, that there was a close relationship between Robert and Elizabeth, even if we can't work out exactly what happened between them.
Wow, that is fascinating. I mean, I think that the primary source evidence that you just quoted it's really, really interesting and gives us a lot to think about. It also kind of leads into the second question that I had for you, Joanne. So what do you make of the modern rumors about Elizabeth concealing a pregnancy and birth? So this is something that people like to talk about with Elizabeth, this possibility. So is this just a modern rumor, or is this something that was talked about at all in the 16th century too?
Yeah, this is another one that I've gotten a few times, and I really appreciate you asking me it again, because I think in the past I've kind of sidestepped it and not been that willing to engage with it. But I think it is worth our talking about, even if I think that the rumor is unfounded. Certainly at the time, in sort of the 1560s in particular, when there were a lot of rumors about Elizabeth and Robert Dudley, there was all sorts of speculation that they'd secretly married. I haven't seen a report from the time that suggests a hidden pregnancy, but certainly by the time you get to the 1580s, we do have a story of someone who claims to have been that love child. And this is the story of Arthur Dudley, which I have avoided talking about. I don't know why, but I've avoided talking about this entire time. So this Arthur Dudley is a person who washes up essentially after claiming a shipwreck in Spain. He gets as far as the Spanish court, telling a story that he is the secret love child between Elizabeth and Robert Dudley. Based on this report, it's very, very detailed, the story he tells about his life. He certainly knew his facts, and in a way, all of it would indeed check out in terms of who he says he was with and when and everything else. And his date of birth would have been somewhere in the summer of 1561, when these rumors were at their height, and shortly after the death of Robert's first wife, Amy Robsart, when, if Elizabeth had been pregnant, they wouldn't have been able to marry because Robert was implicated in his wife's death. So all of that makes Arthur Dudley's story plausible. However, what makes it less than plausible is that Elizabeth, of course, would have had to hide not only her pregnancy, but the childbirth itself and the effects of that childbirth. And for that to have happened without anybody leaving us a source and remarking on it is unlikely in the extreme. We know that there were women who hid pregnancies up until the 9th month. Catherine Gray, for instance, hides her pregnancy successfully, right up to the end. But not as many people were staring at Catherine Gray as they were Elizabeth I. And then to actually give birth and for that child to go unnoticed by all of these people spinning these rumors is very, very unlikely. So I side very much with Sarah Gristwood, has written an analysis of the Arthur Dudley story, that he was almost certainly an imposter and may have even been an agent of the English court itself, that he was probably coached up by Walsingham and maybe even Robert Dudley. That's why his facts all check out. And he was there essentially as a spy.
Well, just that should be an entire podcast series all on its own, Joanne. That is so interesting. I feel like there are just so many layers to peel back with that story. And like you said, it would be difficult to be someone who's in the public eye so much, like Elizabeth I, to try and conceal a pregnancy like some other women were able to do who, could maybe escape to a country home for 2 or 3 months during the height of pregnancy and childbirth in the postpartum period. But that's really fascinating. And thank you for giving us, a little bit of insight into how this rumor might have circulated and might have even been used to the advantage of some people at court, or at least attempted to be used by some of them through, this person that shows up. So we're going to shift gears a little bit. And I have a couple questions for you, Linda. And this is about a relationship that we know existed, but that maybe we don't know the exact details of. So does the popular depiction of Mary, Queen of Scots, longing for a relationship with Queen Elizabeth have any truth behind it? Do we have maybe any documentary proof of Mary wanting a relationship and Elizabeth turning her down? Or was this just a depiction or a rumor that was initiated after the fact to make Elizabeth look guilty for Mary, Queen of Scots' downfall?
No, I don't think it was something that followed Mary, Queen of Scots' execution. But I think you have to stand back a little bit from some of the wording of this kind of rumor and things that Mary may or may not have said, and consider what it might actually have meant in terms of 16th century queenship, basically, because monarchs did tend to be polite to each other. There wasn't a great deal of verbal sparring. I mean, they may have been extremely rude about each other behind the scenes, or even out of sight of foreign ambassadors to courtiers. But I think the expressions that Mary made of wanting a good relationship with Elizabeth were not merely done out of any kind of familial, because they were distantly related, not out of any kind of familial aspect, but perhaps for more political reasons. It was in Mary's interest to get on well with another monarch, particularly if you look at the whole two queens in one isle thing. And I think she felt it would enhance her position in Scotland as well if she had an amicable relationship with Elizabeth. They did exchange portraits, of course, quite what they thought of each other. I think that from an artist's depiction, they kept fairly quiet. And of course, Elizabeth was possibly somewhat sensitive because she was a bit older than Mary, and Mary had this sort of international aura, if you like, of charm and attractiveness. I mean, her portraits as a young woman certainly bear that out. As she gets older, I'm not sure that she particularly looks that much of a stunner, but then neither did Elizabeth, really. So I think these sort of overtures and approaches are part of queenship and diplomacy, though I'm not suggesting that they're totally artificial or even, just flat out lies. Whether the two would ever have liked to have met is again another moot point. When you think about it, monarchs in those days didn't meet very often. And that wasn't, I think, just because of difficulties in traveling and the necessary arrangements that would have to be made. It's also because you both lose a bit of your mystique, I think, if you do actually meet each other. And there is always the possibility of, oh my God, she is taller and better looking than me, or oh my God, she is just more regal than I am, or something like that. So I think that there is a purpose behind it that is political as well as just friendship.
Mm-hmm. That's really, really interesting. I love that you bring up a little bit about their maybe like a personal rivalry there, because we do know, of course, that they were related, but like you said, it wasn't an easy relationship. Can you tell us anything maybe about that personal relationship that the two of them had? I know you said that they exchanged portraits. Do we get any sort of insight into a personal relationship between the two of them in any of their letters or any of these sources? Or was it just something, did they kind of keep each other at arm's length because of the political position they were in?
I think there is an element of keeping each other at arm's length. I think Elizabeth's letters to Mary, particularly if you take, for example, the rather sort of school headmistress type one that she sent to Mary after the death of Lord Darnley, dear madam, this is not good for your reputation and all that. I think poor Mary was probably perfectly well aware of that. It wasn't terribly helpful to have Elizabeth making those kind of comments. And also it was all very well for Elizabeth to have declaimed that, if Darnley had come into her presence and stabbed her Italian secretary she would have attempted to knife him. I mean, it sounds good, but the reality, I think, would have been different. And one of the things that is often used in comparisons between these two women, and undoubtedly they were rivals, you're right, because how could they be anything else? They're on one island, and also they have different religions, very different upbringings, of course, because Mary grew up in the opulent French court, whereas Elizabeth had an upbringing that was, I suppose, might almost be best described as chaotic, really. One of the things that you didn't talk about in relation to rumours about Elizabeth's pregnancies, and probably I shouldn't go there, but I'm going to say it anyhow, is that, of course, the 1560s were not the first time that it had been rumoured that Elizabeth was pregnant. There is the whole Thomas Seymour affair. For a woman who almost certainly never gave birth, Elizabeth, appears on one level to be scattering illegitimate children along the way, though there isn't, I think, any reality to any of this. And I think Joanne's explanation of the supposed son with Robert Dudley is a very interesting one. I have to say it's one I'm not entirely familiar with, so I was very interested to hear that. But no, in terms of Mary and Elizabeth, history has certainly cast it as a difficult relationship and an inevitable rivalry, with Mary sometimes appearing to be more needy in it, almost perhaps than Elizabeth is. But I think they did see each other as rivals, and there was very good reason for them to do that. But that doesn't mean that the overtures for a better relationship weren't necessarily genuine.
I think that's a good point. I think it's hard for us to separate, because Elizabeth is just, she's such a huge figure who has even sort of reached just mythological proportions in public memory, right? And in history, how we remember her. So it's hard to remember that she actually was an individual, a person who, like you said, had these kind of complicated relationships. I like that you bring up Thomas Seymour, because of course that's, another layer that you can add onto Elizabeth. But I think it's important to remember that she was a complex person. She was a human being at the end of the day. We might think of her as the Virgin Queen and as Gloriana, but she's someone who, I think when we look at these rumors, we can kind of get a little bit more of an insight into who she was, maybe as an individual, instead of just thinking about her as the monarch. So thank you both for those really illuminating responses to those questions.
Oh, hey, it's Rebecca here. I'm sorry to interrupt the show. I just want to do a shout out to all of my patrons. And if you love this show, you want to hear more of it, want to show your support, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/tutorsdynasty. Click Become a Patron to find out more info. We got some cool stuff coming up. So let's get back to the show.
I have one final question that I would like for both of you to speak to a little bit, if you feel comfortable doing so, because I think it brings together the rumors surrounding Robert Dudley, which we know, Joanne, you're an expert on that. And it brings together the rumors surrounding Mary, Queen of Scots, which we know, Linda, you're an expert on that. So this is the final question, just to kind of bring the two threads together. So did Elizabeth really propose that her great favorite, Robert Dudley, marry her great rival, Mary, Queen of Scots? And if so, what, and I'm asking to speculate a little bit, what do you think her reasoning might have been behind such a proposal?
Yeah, shall I attempt it first?
You go first, Joanne. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, first of all, I just I muted myself, but I was sat here giggling with the illegitimate children being scattered along the way. I thought that was fantastic. Yeah, I mean, the short answer is there was a proposal, or at least there was one that was discussed. We have records of it. How sincere that proposal was, I think, is a matter for some. Well, it's a matter of contention, and I'll be interested in Linda's point of view on it as well. But we have not only, and I think this is an important point, not only the suggestion that Robert might marry Mary, Queen of Scots, but that he and his brother might be split between the pair of them. And we get this suggestion that Elizabeth was, and I'll quote here, determined to take the one and to give Mary the other. But which one went where doesn't seem to have mattered very much. So they were going to split the Dudley brothers, Ambrose and Robert, between them. And it wasn't just Elizabeth. We have Mary commenting on it as well. She says essentially, and this time I'll just paraphrase, that she wished that Ambrose was as good looking as Robert, because each queen could have one, and they could split them up. Which, I mean, is a fantastic and hilarious image, but it seems to have been a joke, sort of, that they both enjoyed, but does speak to this fear, I think, again, of a sort of Dudley supremacy. It's worth remembering, of course, that this is not that long after the Jane Grey episode, and of course, Jane Grey is in fact Jane Dudley. There was an attempt to take the throne for the Dudley family, so these fears persist. But from Elizabeth's point of view, this sort of an arrangement at least would have given her the benefit of some control. Both Ambrose and Robert appeared to be very loyal servants to her. Ambrose had just come back from a campaign in France, for instance, and so would have given her that inroad into Scotland, and a way of uniting the two kingdoms. But yes, I mean, as we laugh at it now, and they may have laughed at it then.
Poor Ambrose.
It's okay. Ambrose is not a very nice person, generally speaking.
Okay.
So
I won't feel bad for him then. Linda, would you like to weigh in?
Yes, I mean, I agree with what Joanne has said. Whether I don't think Elizabeth meant it as a serious proposal, and that it may have been intended partly to embarrass Mary, really. I mean, for one thing, suggesting that another queen regnant marries someone rumored to be your lover is rather insulting, and there does seem to be some indication that Mary may have responded that way to it. You know, one thing I'd be interested in, Joanne, is that it is true, isn't it, that Robert Dudley didn't want to marry Mary, Queen of Scots? Is there any truth to something? I'm sure I've read it somewhere that this was one of the nefarious schemes of William Cecil, both on the one hand to be rid of Dudley and on the other to make him look bad, whether he said yes or no. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know if we have very clear evidence what Robert really thought about it. But yeah, this certainly falls into the category of time when Cecil was trying to get rid of Robert. He had used, for instance, the death of Amy Robsart to his advantage to try to discredit Robert. Later on in life, they worked together quite a bit, but at this point, there's still quite a bit of animosity. Later, Robert would be crucial in trying to arrange that near missed meeting between Mary, Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth. So I think he tried to have his finger in the pie of Scotland and to make sure that he was integral to Scottish relations. But I don't know that he was happy about this proposal. What's very interesting is later, I think it's in his London home, for which we have an inventory, that sketch of the sort of the map of the death scene of Darnley, Mary Queen of Scots' husband, is hanging in Robert Dudley's home, which I always like to think is his reminder of what could have been had he actually ended up marrying the Queen of Scots, and he dodged a bullet, as it were. So if we want to suggest that is why that is in his home, then certainly he wasn't a fan of the proposal. But yeah, I don't know if there's any concrete evidence of that.
Man, it's interesting. Maybe a proposal that would only benefit Elizabeth politically, but like you said, maybe not personally, if she actually did have that kind of a relationship with Robert Dudley, which most people seem, pretty sure that there was some kind of affection there from Elizabeth to Robert and vice versa. But also, I think, it's one of those things that it speaks to a lot of different aspects of the major players of this time period, where, like you said, Joanne, it speaks to that Dudley ambition and the pushback against that Dudley ambition. And then Linda, like you pointed out, it seems like a maybe not even so thinly veiled insult to Mary, Queen of Scots, for Elizabeth to propose that she marry someone who we know is pretty securely in Elizabeth's pocket at the time, and someone that she, wouldn't, I don't think, necessarily have to worry about kind of turning against her if he did marry Mary, Queen of Scots. So it's an interesting proposal, and interesting to know that it is based in some historical fact, even if maybe it wasn't intended with, as seriously as it might appear. So thank you both for talking a little bit about these rumors that surrounded Elizabeth. I think that this has been a really enlightening discussion that we've had to kind of shed some light on who Elizabeth actually was, and a little bit of light on Mary, Queen of Scots, and Robert Dudley, who, of course, I can't get enough of any of those three people. So thank you both so much for taking the time to chat about this, and I really, really appreciate it. It's been great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. You can follow and support the Tudors Dynasty Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Patreon @Tudors Dynasty.